Hi everyone, welcome. If you were with me 12 days ago, then you'll remember what we did in this bin here. We went ahead and we emptied the 3 yellow buckets in which we had our European nightcrawlers living, and I guess the one thing that I failed to do was affix the stickers to here to show exactly what's living in here. And all we really did was we dumped out the contents of the 3 buckets into here, hoping that we'd have enough room, and we had just about enough room, and we left enough room in here alongside the finished castings to give the worms a place to retreat to get out of the finished castings into nice some fresh bedding over here. And after 12 days, I would have to imagine that a good number of worms have made their way over into this stuff. And just to make sure that this remains nice and comfortable so that the worms would want to keep coming over here, you notice that there was no plastic covering this. I wanted to make sure this stays nice and damp. So I did come in here a few days ago with my squirt bottle, make sure it's nice and moist. So I really wanted to get haul out number 1 of this taken care of. And even though 12 days isn't quite enough to allow any cocoons that might have been left behind to hatch, you know, we will be leaving this to keep going, so that not only do the worms that live in here have a chance to move out into the migration area, but any cocoons that still have yet to hatch can also catch up. So this will be this way for a while, but it did seem reasonable to get in here and take out whatever worms have collected in here so far, and you're never going to believe where those little guys are going to be hauled out into. I'm going to give you one chance to guess. 3, 2, 1. Yes. 3, 2, 1. They're going right back into these yellow buckets, but things are going to be a little bit different now. These are configured to be breeder buckets. Something I've never tried before, but something I've wanted to try for some time now. And the whole idea behind that is that if you take a small number of worms, I think the specific ratio is 100 worms to 1 gallon of bedding, then you're going to trigger a response in those worms to start making cocoons like crazy. And that's what I'm after here. I think what I've got in each of these buckets is about 1.5 gallons. And that means we're going to want to put about 150 worms into each of these buckets. So my aim is to get about 500 worms hauled out of the other bin and release about 150 or so into each of those buckets and get the whole thing started as a breeder setup. All right, well, I'm going to get this thing up on the bench and we're going to haul out and see what we ended up with here after 12 days. So let's get to work. I've got my trusty little plastic box here, and I figured maybe we'll check out how these castings are coming along as far as the depopulation goes, but I really wanted to first do the haul out, get the worms out of here, and then we'll do a little exploration over here, and then we'll do a reset, let this get back to work. So let's just start out by reaching down and carefully extracting the contents of this horizontal migration feeding zone. It does feel to me as my fingers kind of brush through this material that there are a good number of worms squirming around as soon as I touch what's down there. Just hope we have ample room in this box to fit them all. Yeah, it does seem like we've managed to get a pretty decent number of worms to come out of the finished castings. Let's not let these poor little guys get stuck out here on the dry cardboard. Ay, ay, ay. Not easy to pick up a worm, usually. But let's not dawdle. Let's just get this extraction taken care of as quickly as we can. Yeah, every handful seems to have lots and lots of worms in it. I think I'll just let them drop into here for the time being, and then we'll just dump them out into the plastic container here. I'm just growing concerned that we might not have quite enough space in here for them all. And that was the reason I thought that perhaps if we give them a moment out here in the bright lights, maybe they'll dive down and then we could begin carefully extracting some of this bedding material. It looks like our little partitions here have kind of held up. Not bad. We could probably even reuse them, considering the way they look. They look pretty decent. All right, I'm not going to worry too much about being very precise here, because this is only haul out number 1. There'll be future opportunities to get the balance of the worms out of here. And something tells me we've already extracted sufficient numbers of worms into this container here to suit our needs for launching off those 3 breeder bins. So perhaps we can just get right down to reconstructing this setup. I'm curious to see how we can pull this off. I didn't really think this through in terms of all the specific details. I just figured let's take the old ready, shoot, aim approach and not allow ourselves to get caught up in the whole analysis paralysis syndrome. Those are a couple expressions I learned from one of my favorite bosses back in the old corporate days, working for big business. All right, let's also just go ahead and take a moment or two to see how these castings are looking, and then we'll be able to hopefully return things to the way they were. It does seem to me like we should at least take out all of this stuff over here, all of this, I don't know. There's a good amount of nice castings in here. We should probably leave those behind. All right. I guess my only thought here was that it would be a shame to litter the really nice castings with all this shredded paper and cardboard, so I really like to try to leave it all the way over there on that edge. And I don't want to cover it up necessarily either. I just want to do a little bit of an exploration down into this material here. With only cardboard coverings, there's been an opportunity left for this material to dry and potentially give the worms occupying it the incentive that they would need to leave it. But I can already tell right away that there's still lots and lots of worms living in this stuff. I really didn't expect for a complete evacuation to happen over here. I did actually expect a good number of worms to still be in here. And I guess that's actually a good thing, because it's telling me that the material probably is still adequate in terms of moisture content for the cocoons left behind in the material to mature to the point where they can hatch and that the babies can come out of them and then get caught up with the rest of the crowd over in the collection area. I have even thought about possibly infusing this material over here with even more moisture just to promote the hatching of the cocoons, and then at some point later we would have plenty of time to allow this stuff to dry, and then we could really do a good migration of the worms out of the stuff. You could see a lot of the worms have been making their way over towards the feeding area, or the migration area, whatever you want to refer to it as, because that was the area where we had placed in some foods that would, I guess they were probably placed in there frozen, so they would cause some nice moisture, which would, I guess, either attract the worms or at least, you know, convince worms that do stumble on it as a matter of chance to just stay near it. So hopefully this is an indication of what we might expect to find once we start picking around the material that we just extracted. Okay, not bad, not bad. So I think in order to get this reconstructed, it would be pretty good if we can recycle some of the bedding materials that we took over into here. So I'm thinking if I could carefully start pulling some of these things out. Some of these things I'm assuming will have already been evacuated by the worms because of their, you know, sensing the bright lights overhead. Any ones that are still hanging out on this stuff, I could easily just kind of shake them off. And even here we've got some of these little standoffs that we were using to help us. Let's get these wormies back over here. Now, let's not be too particular here. Let's just get this taken care of. So these things were out here to sort of help us prop up the partition wall that was put out there. And the partition wall was not meant to leave or, you know, segment the worms away from where we wanted them to gather. It was just there to be as sort of a visual aid and maybe a more of a separator to keep the nice castings from getting contaminated with all the bedding material that we're placing into the collection area. So my hope is that we're going to stumble on the other standoffs that were used in here to help me rebuild kind of the way it was set up 12 days ago. It's always interesting to see how the worms like to collect within these tubes. So these tubes are just kind of a spacer, a really rough sort of a spacer, just to help me see, you know, that I've got the right equal distance. But you know how this stuff is. None of this needs to be done with any degree of precision. It's kind of like cooking, right? A little dash of this, a little splash of that. Usually you're going to end up with a pretty good finished product, even if you're not overly precise. Okay. Got lots and lots of worms hanging out here, which is kind of cool. And I had really hoped to be able to pull out as much of the bedding material that we extracted here as possible, ideally taking only worms with us to the new residence, to the new breeder residence. But there again, I'm not going to be letting myself get too caught up in the precision of the whole exercise. I just like to try to get it done kind of quick and dirty, but at least make sure all of the basic requirements for what we're trying to accomplish here are satisfied in terms of having enough worms to launch off the breeder bins, having enough bedding material with which to resume activity over in the collection area. So I'm guessing we've probably got a few more larger chunks of stuff. Oh, look at that, we've even got a corn cob over here. I'm wondering what other large bits of food we might have used to build up the migration area. Yeah, let's just keep at what we were doing here, pulling out these larger chunks of newspaper. Oops, don't want to let any wormies end up on the tablecloth here. Tablecloth's really dry stuff, and if I don't catch them in time, they could end up drying up right there. Perhaps it would have been a bit easier if I had used a slightly larger container into which we extracted the contents of the collection area. Might have made this, what I'm doing here, a little bit simpler. Although it does seem to me like we're getting a pretty good number of the large chunks of bedding material out of here successfully. I think we got all of the tubes. I believe there were 3 tubes used as standoffs, as spacers. And I think just from combing my hands through the material down low, we've managed to collect most, if not all, of these larger chunks of newspaper. It was the reason we used large chunks like this, so that it would be easy enough to extract them at some point in the near future. So I'm glad the plan is playing out as hoped. I'm just wondering how many more large chunks we still have in here, if any. Because if there aren't too many, then perhaps we can start letting the worms dive down into this material. And then perhaps we can gradually come back over the course of a few minutes and just skim little bits of the stuff sitting out here on the surface and return it. Because I've got a feeling once we do that, we'll be able to take what's at the very bottom of this container and have a good number of worms with which to launch these breeder bins. And I guess, you know, the ideal way to do this would be to pick through all the worms and make sure that every worm that's being launched off into the breeder bins is a mature worm at that age that it could breed And that's the part of it that I'm a little reluctant to spend a lot of time on. It does seem a little bit tedious to individually examine hundreds of worms in order to verify that each and every one of them is already, you know, grown to that point where it can mate. And even for that matter, I can't even say for sure that my worm bins are all exclusively populated with the type of worm that I believe to be in the boxes. So even though I've always managed my European nightcrawlers to the best of my ability in such a way that I don't let them get tangled up with other worms, I do know that the way I arrange things and keep things, sometimes I position bins above each other in higher shelves. So there might have been a point in time where these European nightcrawler bins were residing either on the floor, beneath some shelves, holding other types of worms above them, meaning I guess that possibility always exists that some foreign types of non-European nightcrawler worms did possibly plop down into my European nightcrawler bins over the years I've had these, and kind of mixed the breeds. But I'm not really after selling these little guys. I'm really just doing this for fun for myself. Although who knows, if I find myself in overload mode with many more worms on my hands than I need, then I guess the possibility always exists that I might branch into trying to sell them. I've toyed with the idea, but I've never really taken it seriously or thought that I would actually follow through with it wholeheartedly. Yeah, but sometimes the idea does seem interesting to consider and brainstorm on. So now I suppose this little guy making his way through one of the little access holes that I created in these little partition walls. So now it would be nice if I could build this out a little bit more, perhaps with some of this bedding material. But you know what? I think we're going to take a short pause just to give the worms out here a chance to dive down. And perhaps I'll do it off camera. I'm just going to start gradually extracting bits of this stuff on top to try to refill this feeding area, collection area, with some of this bedding and leave only worms in this if possible, or at least make the majority of what remains in this plastic container worms. So I'm going to do some of this off camera, and we'll resume once I've got something that looks a little closer to the finished product over here. So let's cut now. So now during a couple of these pauses that I gave the worms a chance to dive down into the material, I went ahead and I grabbed some yummy foods that we could rebuild the feeding zone with. And I even created a little bit of an extension for enabling us to build up this little divider partition wall a bit better, so that I can really stack up the feeding zone high and then still be able to backfill with the finished castings. So what I had in mind for this piece here was just to sort of snug it in here, just as a slight extension, which would permit me to further backfill with castings on this side, and then we could really start loading up the feeding zone. And what we're going to feed up the feeding zone with is a lot of this reclaimed bedding over here. And you know, it's during these times that we're giving the worms a little bit of a chance to continue diving down. And then all I would do after a little bit of time has lapsed is just come in here, scoop out a little bit more of this material that we're going to recycle to rebuild with, giving the worms more and more opportunities to continue diving down. If I were to, in a case like this, pull out some small worms, I would just leave them and they could just get returned into the collection area. But if they were bigger, then I would kind of throw them in the corner over here so that they can be right at the very bottom along with all the other worms that are diving and diving and diving in an attempt to outrun my advances as I keep picking away. So every time I would find a worm large enough to breed, and I would normally just use its basic size as a judgment call as to whether it was big enough. But usually if there's that clitellum, that little bulge on the body, then that's a worm that's mature enough to mate. So I would just sort of selectively pick any ones that seem like they were big enough to meet that criteria and drop them down into that corner as I would continue to pick off more and more material. But I believe we've collected enough material here with which we can probably start rebuilding the feeding area with further. You can see I did manage to pull yet another large piece of paper out as I was going through this stuff. So I had a hunch that there'd still be at least one more large piece, but that was the only one that was remaining. But I think we're now at the point where we can drop in the foods and then use all of this to cover it up with. And then we're going to be almost at that point where this can simply continue, put it back up on the shelf. The other thing I figured we would do is boost up our capability of this to retain its moisture rather than letting it get lost to evaporation by using skimpy top coverings. And I've got a piece of plastic that we're going to drape over the top here so that it'll remain even more damp and cozy, so that hopefully even more worms will gather over on this side. And, well, I guess sort of just thinking out loud here, you remember when we went through the material over here and there was just loads and loads of worms? It almost made me think that if I was really trying to recruit 150 or so worms for this mission, for these breeder buckets, maybe I would have simply been better off taking a whole bunch of material right out of here, running it through my screen, and whatever worms were big enough to get caught in the screening process would be the ones that would be used for the breeding exercise, rather than doing it this way. This is a bit tedious and time consuming, but it's usually when you're working your way through a tedious and time consuming chore that your brain starts figuring out easier ways that the same objective could have been accomplished. So I don't mind delving into a sort of half-baked plan if the exercise ultimately leads me to coming up with perhaps a better way to go about doing it the next time. So this is kind of about as high as I thought we might want to go here. And I'm almost wondering if we could simply take this and sort of subdivide it 3 separate ways and use these as the breeders. Because it's not so important that we exclude all of this bedding material that they're inhabiting, and it's also not so important that we somehow pick out all the juveniles. In my mind, if we just take 1/3 of this and drop it into each of those buckets, that should be suitable for getting these breeder bins underway. Even though there's a whole bunch of little juveniles mixed in, maybe the next time if we do that sifting approach, then maybe we'll have better luck rounding up just more mature worms rather than a big mishmash of all different types. Because you'll remember right down here, right? This was the material where we had noticed a good number of worms inhabiting the material, and here they're inhabiting material that would pass immediately through a really fine screen, leaving only worms. And I believe in no time we would have pretty much worms only, and not even any bedding material going along for the ride. But that sort of occurred to me a little late in the game. And that's okay, I really don't mind. So it's all in good fun as far as I'm concerned. I usually get a kick out of fiddling around with the little wormies like so. And now all we're going to do is restore these top coverings more or less the way we found them, except this time we're going to gain the added benefit of also covering up with plastic above the feeding area for much greater moisture retention, which should also spur on greater attraction of worms over into this area by keeping this area nice and damp rather than letting it dry out and become perhaps not as nice for the worms to hang out in. So after 12 days, I think we did a pretty good job rounding up a fair number of worms. I have no idea how many are in here, but I'd like to think that we've got at least 150 times 3, 450 worms. You know, I mean, if you consider what we just looked at here, I don't know. It might be possible that we're talking about even twice that many. I don't know. I don't know if I'm kind of going overboard here. Putting too many worms into my breeder bins. I don't know. You got to start somewhere, and this is my first try, so I'm okay with fouling things up, and usually I'll get tons and tons of really awesome input from the viewers who've done stuff like this in the past and can speak from experience. So this is just my way of sort of prompting good constructive criticism from the viewers, which I'm always open for. I'm always open for constructive criticism. I don't take it personally, but before we put this away, I just don't want to leave any little wormies stranded out on the dry. So let's just make sure we don't do that. Alright, I think we're safe and sound here. Alright, let's put this thing back on the shelf. Perhaps we'll just wait another 12 days or so, and at that point 24 days will have lapsed. And, you know, granted, the worms hanging out here are probably still laying cocoons, and I know it's not a perfect setup, but whatever. I think it's time to start off our breeder bins and launch those worms we collected, so let's do that next. Alright, so we are in the home stretch here, and I really had no intention of going too crazy with making a major production out of this. I just figured I'd grab what appears to be about a third of what's in this bucket here, or this plastic tub, drop it in, and with that we'll be launching breeder bin number 1, or breeder bucket number 1. Now, whether or not we're really releasing 150 worms into here, or more, it's really tough to say, but as we do sometimes, I'm going to spread them out a bit so we could see how many we're dealing with. Let them retreat, and we'll proceed to getting the next bin launched. Alright, I don't think we need to wait to see them all retreat down into the material. We'll just proceed to getting the next one launched similarly. Now, when I built these bins, I spent a good amount of time down here prior to coming down with the camera to start this. So I'm pretty much ready to call it a day. Perhaps that's why I'm not really prolonging this beyond just cutting them loose. And I really didn't want to get back into filming down inside of these buckets, because that's always a pain in the neck too. So let's let these little guys settle in, and then we can get the last bin launched off. So besides what I estimate to be about 1.5 gallons worth of bedding in each bucket, I also came in here with coffee and worm chow so that each one is pre-fed. And I might come back in here at some point, maybe not make a big video production out of it, but over the next few weeks while these systems are in the process of generating cocoons, which is their basic mission, I'll probably come in with some more food for these little guys just to keep them inspired and in that breeding mood. But I think that after about perhaps, I don't know, 21 to 24 days or so, which is what I believe is the amount of time it takes for a cocoon to hatch, I'm going to be looking to get these worms out of here. Because I'm going to assume that on day 1 they're going to be starting right into the creation of cocoons. So I want to be able to get those cocoons isolated and the worms moved off onto their new chores or their next mission, and really focus on treating these as breeder bins. So that's pretty much where we stand with my new experiment with breeder bins. Probably not as ideal as it could be. Probably not a perfect setup, but hey, you got to start somewhere, like I said before. And, you know, in hindsight, I already think I saw one possible improvement for retrieving worms from the castings that they're inhabiting right now. I'm also thinking that when it comes time to separate the cocoons out of this material in a few weeks, shaking the material through some sort of screen might be the way to play it. That seems like the most practical way to accomplish that. So I guess we'll play it by ear. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.